So, the keynote speech, it will be by Professor Dr. Marco Caliendo from the University of Potsdam. He will present the fundamentals of evaluation of labor market policies, and Mr. Caliendo will join us through online channels. So, I hope that Marco is with us. Good morning.
Good
morning.
The
online stage is yours.
Excellent. Thank you for having me, and thank you for the nice introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. Of course, I would have loved to be also with you in person, but unfortunately my teaching load has started, and so I have to teach a lot this and the next week, so I couldn't make it. But anyways, I heard that you had already a great conference, a great congress so far, and so basically let's hope that we can keep that up. So my name is Marco Caliendo. I'm Professor of Empirical Economics at the University of Potsdam, and I'm also Director of Evaluation Office. And basically in the last 20 years, I have been involved in a lot of counterfactual impact evaluations of labor market policies. And so basically I have also seen the rise in many countries, or the interest in doing evidence-based labor market policies based on really quantitative results. And so I want to give you some impressions from my side as an evaluator, what can be done and what are probably good ideas. So let me get right into it. Basically, this is not new to most of you. So basically, when we talk about counterfactual impact evaluation, always what we want to do is we want to measure the causal impact of a certain policy on affected units. Yeah? So of course I could not, instead of saying units, I could also say individuals, let's say unemployed individuals or job searching individuals. But sometimes these units are also firms or even counties, regional labor markets, or even countries. Yeah? The methods we have are basically independent of the size of the unit. The central question that we want to answer is that what would have happened had the affected unit not received the treatment. So usually, basically, we observe like participants in active labor market policies. We know their outcome after they have participated. But in order to get like a causal impact, we would like to know what would have happened to their labor market outcomes like employment or income had they not participated. And in order to get this causal effect, we need to compare their observed outcome with the counterfactual situation that we don't have, and that's basically the fundamental evaluation problem. Yeah? Because for the participants, we observe the outcome with participation, and for the non-participants, we only observe the outcome without participation. So basically what that means is we need some form of proxy, and we need to find some comparison group. And of course, the big problem that we all know is that there is selection bias. What does that mean? Basically, participants and non-participants might differ even in absence of the program. Yeah? So for example, if we don't take this picture literally, but let's should signal that we have some low qualified men participating, and basically we don't want to compare them with high qualified women, because even in absence of the program, they would have different outcomes on the labor market. And therefore any simple mean comparisons are not very useful, because we would get selection bias. And that's exactly also the reason why any simple cross-section estimation is not very helpful for us. So luckily, there are a couple of well-established methods that help us to solve that problem and to overcome selection bias. And it's really nice also for that Congress, because like in the last 2 or 3 years, basically 2 Nobel Prizes were given to researchers exactly working on these methods that help us to solve the selection bias. Yeah, so basically in 2009, the Risk-Bank Prize in Economic Sciences in memory of Alfred Nobel was awarded jointly to Banerjee, Duflo, and Kremer, basically for the experimental approach to alleviating global poverty. And so basically, while they, looked mainly on global poverty, the methods they use are, of course, also very applicable to any evaluation of labor market policies. And then in 2021, basically David Card, Josh Angrist, and Guido Imbens received the prize. David Card for his empirical contribution to labor economics, and Josh Angrist and Guido Imbens for their methodological contributions to the analysis of causal relationships. And basically, these are also the front runners when we talk about, which methods can we apply in order to get causal impacts when we think about the evaluation of labor market policies. And so this is also a bit like, what I want to do today. I want to very briefly tell you something about experiments, matching difference in regression discontinuity designs, always giving also an example from which I think that it's, nice to see and innovative in the application. But before I do that, let me very, very briefly tell you something about, I told you that I'm, working in evaluation for the last 20 years. And let me very briefly tell you something about, like, from an evaluator's perspective, what would be an ideal world scenario when we think about evaluations. And of course, like, the first thing I have to say is, like, in an ideal world, the evaluator would already be involved at very early stages of the program design and also has influence on the data that is collected later for evaluation. Basically, and if we think about program design, these stages basically include first defining the program's goals, then developing a theory of change, then designing the program. After that is done, and that's when also like the evaluator comes into place, then there needs to be an implementation and the collection of baseline data, collecting the final outcome data, and finally the sixth step, then the counterfactual impact evaluation. I'm very often asked, because like I'm a counterfactual impact evaluator, but clearly there are also other ways to do evaluation, and I'm always asked whether these are competing processes. And I would say no, because I think very deeply that process evaluation, which focuses on program implementation and the operation of the program, and impact evaluation should be really viewed as complements. Yeah, so basically, we can use the information that is collected in process evaluation to choose amongst alternative evaluation estimators. And clearly, this knowledge that we gain also in process evaluation helps us to make the estimates that we get in counterfactual impact evaluation much more credible, and therefore helps us also to to get better estimates, which in the future also help us to improve any program design. And the second thing is like, if we think about the ideal world scenario, then there are a couple of important questions which should already be answered at the design stage. Clearly, if we think about aims and measure of success, so we need to know what are the intended effects of the program, how do we want to measure success of the program. We need to have like a good theory of change, theoretical backbone in our operation. Yeah, so we need to know the sequence of events that lead to the observed outcomes. And clearly, we are also interested to identify the channels that contribute to the success of the program. Yeah, so if you have like a multi-layered program, let's say a multi-layered job search program that helps unemployed to reintegrate into the labor market, maybe it has a training element, maybe it has like a boostering of social skills element, and in the end, we also want to know which of the parts of the program were there in order to really affect the outcome. Once this is clear, then we can decide about the empirical strategy. Yeah, so we can say, okay, what type of evaluation methodology should be pursued? Very important question at this stage is already how can we gather the necessary data that we need for our evaluation? And then also, like, if we really think about that from the beginning, we might also be able to distinguish the theoretical mechanisms which are most important in order to achieve the outcome. So let's say in an ideal world, the evaluators, they have sufficient time, budget, and high quality data at their disposal. But as we all know, probably, I mean, this is the ideal world scenario, but you know, in some situations, you are also confronted with a real world scenario. And then what you have to do, you have to basically do like shoestring evaluations. You have to perform your evaluations under less than optimal circumstances. Yeah. So basically, maybe take something back for today first. From today, is basically to say, hopefully, you know, if we have enough time and if you have also enough budget, then you know it would always be nice to strive for the ideal world scenario, even though I know that in many cases it's not possible. Okay, but this was just like a brief introduction, like into the evaluation framework. Let me now tell you really something about like these 4 methods that I wanted to show you. The first one is the most straightforward one, and that's experiments. So what's the idea of experiments? Well, here with experiments, we can say that we assign the individuals from the eligible population randomly. So let's say we have like 100 eligible job seekers, and we have a training program which with the capacity of 50 participants. And then basically in a random experiments, what I would do is that I would randomly assign, like from the pool of eligible individuals, those into the program. 50, let's say 50 go into the program, and the other 50 go into the comparison group. And then basically, if you look at the individuals, both in the treatment and the comparison group, then you see the exact same amount of individuals wearing a top hat, a baseball cap, and a bonnet. And basically, if these, if there are no differences in the characteristics of individuals in both groups, then basically the observed outcome differences between the 2 groups can be solely attributed to the treatment. Yeah, and then basically this clearly makes the job for an evaluator very easy, because then the only thing you need to do is you need to compare the cross-sectional mean differences after the program took place between the treatment group and the comparison group, and this will give you your causal treatment impact. And one example that I picked out, it's not that recent, but it's basically by French colleagues, by Bruno Crépin, Esther Duflo, and some more colleagues, and they ran like an experimental study in France between 2007 and 2010. And the idea or the research question that they had is what the direct and indirect effects of job placement assistance on the labor market outcomes of young educated job seekers in France are. Yeah? So this paper was published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, which is basically one of the top journals in our profession. So what they did, I mean, this is really an interesting program, because like this was like a cooperation between like academic researchers and the public employment services. So what they did, they ran a randomized experiment which was designed basically to evaluate these effects. They ran it across like 235 labor markets in France. And basically in each labor market, the eligible job seekers were randomly assigned to the treatment. And the nice thing about the study is that there was regional variation in the treatment intensity. So for example, in some labor markets, only 25% of participants were allowed. In other labor markets, 50%, 75%, or even 100%. And so basically what they show in their paper is that after 8 months, the eligible unemployed youth who were assigned to the program were significantly more likely to have found a stable job than those who were in the control group. Yeah? So those who did not receive the treatment. So this is like like a positive effect, but what they were also able to identify is actually quite a large displacement effect. So basically, they showed that the positive effect for those for the treated came at the price of a negative effect for those who did not receive the treatment. Yeah, and so clearly this is a very important thing to do, which is not often possible to identify, like in these counterfactual impact evaluation studies, because they basically not only looked at the direct effect of the treatment on the participants, but they also took like the indirect effect on the non-participants into account. And therefore it's like, you know, it's super highly published, and it was a very influential study, making us think about that we should not only think about direct effects, but also about indirect effects. Okay, so second method I want to show you is like, first we had experiments, but you know, in many cases, you know, running experiments is also like a costly intervention. And sometimes we just have not the resources or the time to plan and run an experiment. And then what we end up with is like data on participants, and maybe then we have some comparison group from the general population or even from the unemployment registers. But clearly there might also be selection bias between these groups. Yeah. So and this is when matching comes into place. So the idea here is, you know, to choose for each participant one or many statistical twins from the sample of non-participants, and they basically should be identical in all relevant characteristics. Yeah. So to take up the example from the experiment, let's say we have like the individual with the top hat. So like we have a participant with a top hat, and so basically we would compare him with a statistical twin who also wears a top hat. Yeah, and so clearly, like, you know, wearing this top hat is not meant literally, but what we mean here is that basically, like, these individuals, they should be identical in all relevant characteristics that are important for their labor market outcomes and the selection into programs. And clearly, you can imagine that this is quite a strong assumption, because you really need very, very informative data. And so this is a big problem, because the more data you need, the less likely, or the more data you want to control for. Let's say you want to control for education, age, previous unemployment experience, the region the individual lives in, household context, and so on. And if you have a high number of relevant characteristics, then it's very unlikely that you will really find an individual in the comparison group who is like 100% identical. There's one solution to that, basically, and this is then called propensity score matching, which basically summarizes all information from the characteristics that I just told you into one index, builds one number, and then basically compares individuals based on that one number. If we want to apply matching or propensity matching, then basically what we need to take away is that better data helps us a lot. Yeah, because you can imagine, like, I mean, if we really want to, you know, condition on the characteristics that are relevant, you know, for labor market outcomes and selection to treatments, we need really informative data sources. And these data sources in some countries can come from administrative sources, which are quite resourceful already. Like in Scandinavia, you have a lot of information about unemployed and job seekers in the administrative data. But often you can improve the estimates if you combine several data sources. Yeah, so you can, you know, the individual the level data can be complemented by firm level data or regional data. And what's really also, like, in the last 5 to 10 years became very popular is also to combine administrative data with survey data. Because, like, in the administrative data, a lot of things that have been proven to be quite relevant for someone's success on the labor market, like personality characteristics or risk preferences or even motivation or cognitive skills, they are usually not in the administrative data, and therefore it is quite interesting also, you know, to run additional surveys which complement the administrative data with additional survey information. And I think after my session, we will also see an example of that in the program. Just one example here. So this is a study that we did like in 2016, where the task was to evaluate startup subsidies. So to answer the question whether startup subsidies for the unemployed are an effective active labor market program. And clearly, if we think about, also the entrepreneurship literature, then it tells us that, to become an entrepreneur or to start up your own business, you have to have like certain traits that, distinguish you also from your peers. And so only looking at unemployed individuals, or basically, comparing unemployed individuals who start up a business, who take up the grant, with those who don't, potentially we would also have had a omitted variable bias when we only use the administrative data. And that's exactly the reason why we ran a large-scale survey with participants and non-participants, where we also, asked them about their entrepreneurial intention, their personality traits, their risk preferences, and so on. Yeah, and so basically we could match the participants and the non-participants based on a large set of characteristics that are usually unobserved also. And basically what we could show is that, these startups subsidies, they have a very positive effect on employment probabilities and income. And these results, they are very robust also to the inclusion of the usually unobserved personality traits. Because in previous literature, there was always very often the criticism that if you use matching studies in that context, then, you omit some important variables because they are not in the administrative data sources. So combining data is usually also a very good way to improve your estimates. Okay, so let me be very briefly about the on the difference in difference strategy. It's basically quite an old strategy. Yeah. So David Card and Josh Angrist in the 1980s and early 1990s, they already used it quite extensively. And the idea in the difference in difference is that we have a group of participants and we have a group of non-participants, and we observe them at 2 points in time, before the treatment takes place and after the treatment takes place. And then basically what we do is we combine like before-after estimates for the treatment and the control group. And by comparing these changes within the groups, we implicitly control for any time constant unobserved factors between the two groups. Yeah, so that's basically quite an easy way to do such an evaluation. Of course, we have to assume that the time trend for the two groups is the same. Yeah, so we assume that the time trend for the comparison group is basically a proxy for the situation that we would have observed for the treatments had they not received the treatment. And then basically what we do is like we compare the changes in the treatment group over time with the changes in the comparison group over time. And I just put this example here because David Card, like he received the Nobel Prize basically last year also because like on that paper, because like in this paper was published in the American Economic Review. By the time it was very innovative, and even though it's quite an old paper, basically most of the evaluations that are done also with respect to the minimum wage to these days, they are still done with these difference in difference estimators. Yeah, so just to give you a brief idea here, so what their idea was, so New Jersey increased the minimum wage from $4.25 to $5.05 per hour in April 1992. And the authors, they were interested in the effect of this minimum wage increase on employment levels. And so what they did is basically, very, very nice idea. They said, okay, so if in New Jersey the minimum wage goes up, what could be like a good comparison group? And they looked across the state border. So they looked to Pennsylvania and they said, okay, let's take a sample of individuals working in the fast food industry, which are, regionally close together, but, half of or some of the sample is in New Jersey and some of the other sample is in Pennsylvania, where the minimum wage raise did not take place. And then basically what they do is like this, on the left-hand side, February 1992, you see the minimum wages, the distribution of wages in both states. And you see like it's all over the place, very similar between New Jersey and Pennsylvania. So that seems to be like a good control group. And then in November 1992, everyone in New Jersey gets at least the minimum wage of $5.05. But in New Jersey, in Pennsylvania, not much else has happened. And then what the authors can do is that they can look at the employment levels in Pennsylvania and New Jersey before and after the minimum wage was increased. And in the end, they conclude that the minimum wage did not have any negative impacts on employment in that region. Yeah? And so basically this idea was then used or is still used also now for minimum wage evaluations, and so it's still quite important. Okay, and the last method I just want to briefly tell you a bit about is called. Thanks. I mean, sorry to be offline for a couple of seconds, but actually it was quite interesting because everything Anna was telling, I mean, it's like it's just showing that there's already a lot of progress in that direction. How we can estimate, causal impacts and how we can implement them. Let me just say, I mean, Anna mentioned that experiments are the gold standard, and that's absolutely true. But I just also want to emphasize that with the methods I presented, you can actually get quite close, or you can even have the same quality of causal impacts than with experience. Let me just briefly mention like the final slide I had on the methods. This was this regression discontinuity design. And the idea here is basically that sometimes we have like these cutoffs implemented in our labor laws. For example, in Austria, it was that in 1989, the government increased the potential unemployment benefit duration from 30 to 39 weeks for individuals 40 and older at the time of job separation. Yeah, so basically everyone who was 40 or older had 39 weeks of potential benefit duration. Everyone who was up to 39 years only had 30 weeks of potential benefit duration. And this regression discontinuity design then compares basically people who are just above the cutoff with people who are just below the cutoff. Yeah? And so it's very similar to experiments also. It's a very nice way if you can't run experiments, and you get also very nice effects here. Let me just briefly summarize, because I also want to leave some time for questions to me and also to Anna. So basically, we all want to do evidence-based labor market policy, and therefore we need to ensure a successful program evaluation. And basically, my advice is to involve the evaluators as early as possible, and already plan the evaluation method while designing the project. A very important lessons that we have learned, and that's already also implemented in many of the things that Anna presented, is that better data helps us a lot. Yeah, so the combination of different data sources, for example, administrative and survey data, can be very helpful in many situations. But also, in order to set that up, this may take time. Yeah, so if you want to run a survey, you need to design the survey, you need to do a baseline survey, you need to do a follow-up survey. So this will take time. So also getting like causal impacts will take time. So most likely this will not be done, let's say 6 months after the program has finished, because usually you are also interested like in the long-term effect. And if you design new programs, then it may also be useful to directly also think about collecting new data specifically for the program evaluation. And so what I have learned in the last 20 years I would say it's very important to be opportunistic and prioritize, because basically you can do anything, but you can't do everything, and you certainly can't do everything at once. Yeah. So what do I mean by that? Well, if you don't know anything about the functioning of a program, then learning something very simple can be very powerful for you. But without serious, long-standing research partnerships between policymakers, academics, and other stakeholders, we can make very little progress in terms of, delivering really evidence-based labor market policies. And therefore, I would say it's, good evaluations take a long time. You need to think, you need to start thinking about them very early, and then the chance to be successful is much higher. And clearly, I would love to also say, if I would be with you now, I would say, okay, if you have any questions, come to me also during the coffee break or during lunch. So since that is not possible, I'm also happy to take any questions by email. So if there's anything, in my slides that caught your interest, or if you have any questions about that, feel free to contact me. And now I'm also happy to take any questions that you might have. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Marco. Please, Anne, come also to the stage. We have time for a couple of questions to Marco and Anne. So if you would like to ask, then raise your hand and we will bring you the microphone.
Thank you very much. My name is Michel van Smolenburg from UWV of the Netherlands. I have a question for both of you. First, Professor Marco Caliendo, about a randomized experiment. I have a question about this. When you, for example, by coincidence, have a larger proportion of people with a relevant characteristic in your experiment group. So it's not selection bias, but, well, it's relevant and it's disproportional. Would you correct for this?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. Of course, so of course, like in an ideal experiment, you would not really get that, but sometimes it happens by, if we randomize, then by luck or by chance, this can be. And then I would really say, depending on the magnitude of the difference, then you would need some post-experimental stratification methods that you use. So yes, I would say if it's really out of balance, then you probably need to, then you will need to correct for it. Because basically, in a sense, if you can't achieve like a perfect balancing with the experiment, then you might introduce a selection bias that it's not planned.
Thank you, thank you. And another question for Anne. The last slide, it was a bit difficult for me to interpret this one. I was wondering if, when there is a skills obstacle, it's correlated very oftenly with other problems, so it's a multi-problem situation, or is it harder to diagnose people with skills obstacles?
Mm-hmm. So in this case, what you saw was so about 50% of people who received active labor market policies, so people who had definitely a skill obstacle, but had also some other obstacle potentially, or some of them maybe even 3 or 4 obstacles, but they all had at least skill obstacle. So out of them who got a policy, 50% got a skill-related policy. And people who had definitely a health obstacle, but also might have had some skill obstacles, some other obstacles. Out of them also 50% got a skill-related active labor policy and so on. So it was very similar. I think there was minor differences. So of course, if you expect that people who have skill-related obstacles, for sure, maybe some others, the share of them getting a skill-related active labor policy would be higher, but in this case, we didn't see it. So of course, there are several reasons, potentially. For example, whether the data was not sufficient, what we had to use. Of course, there was quite a lot of dimensions, the qualification data, language data, and a bit beyond that, but also, of course, not covering all kind of skills, all kind of licenses that people might have. So whether there's something about that. But it can be also, of course, the policy advice that we should be even more mindful about people with skill obstacles, that maybe the coverage of these policies are not at the moment sufficient. Well, in this case, in this year, so maybe it has already changed, but yeah, that's what the data analysis showed.
Thank you.
Bonjour. Alors je voudrais d'abord faire une petite réflexion par
Thank you. Right, first of all,
un peu Elton Mayo dans les études.
I would like to react to what you Professor Marco Caliendo said, and Michael Ayre, who mentioned about the General Electric conducted surveys using the same methodology already back in 1920s.
Est-ce que le profilage statistique,
I wanted to ask you
dans la mesure
about statistical profiling,
d'éloignement d'un chercheur d'emploi sur le marché,
whether it is possible to use this type of profiling in
sur l'insertion
the
professionnelle,
effect evaluation? Can it be used as a tool for evaluation when we assess how a job seeker has been integrated into the labor market?
Okay, thank you. I mean, that's an excellent question. Also, like the General Electric experiment in 1920, which was basically one of the earliest, which also failed. Because in that experiment, basically researchers went into a plant and tried to change the work environment and see how that affects the work performance of people. But the thing is, like, the workers felt under monitoring and behaved very differently, no matter what the experimentalists did. And so basically, like in the literature, this is one of the things which goes down as quite a failure in experimental evaluations, because the experimentalists they changed the behavior of the individuals they were surveying, and therefore this is like this of course we always have to be very careful not to do that. But talking about profiling and whether we can use that, I would say yes, but remember, a good profiling needs a very good evidence-based evaluation before, because only, as Anna said, only if we know which program works for whom, then we can also give like a good profiling advice. Yeah, so if we know, for example, that training programs work for, let's say, males or females with certain set of qualifications or problems on the labor market, then when another individual with these, with these characteristics comes into the agency, then we can give a good profiling advice. Yeah, so I think like profiling is the next step after we have already gathered information on the impacts of different programs.
We have time for one more question.
thank you very much.
Sorry.
I have here on the back row. Elina Kallas is here from Estonian Unemployment Insurance Fund, and I have a question for Professor Caliendo. Thank you very much for your presentation. So my question is, what is your opinion on using systematic reviews and meta-analysis for creating or supporting to create labor market policies when the data is missing, incomplete, or not available? What is your opinion? Thank you.
You know, this is some of the situations where you also have to be like a bit opportunistic. I would say, like, of course, like if you're in a situation where you can have data for your country for the situation that you are analyzing, then that would be the first best solution. If this, for any other reason, is not possible, then you have to think about what's the second best solution, and then maybe like a meta-analysis, you know, of programs that were run in different but similar countries in similar time periods could be helpful. Yeah, and in general, what we also like to do is like a meta-analysis could also be that you look at the training programs in all OECD countries and then see whether you can find any common effects across the countries and see whether we can learn anything like more general that's not country specific. And therefore, I think also like a meta-analysis in that direction can be very helpful. But in general, I would say if you introduce like a new program in a specific country, then without going in there directly and also doing like a counterfactual impact evaluation in the given institutional setting, it will be difficult, you know, to come up with really quantitative effects that you can say the program has raised employment probabilities by a certain amount or income by a certain amount. That will be very, very hard to do, like with any meta-analysis that you mentioned.
So now it's time for the break for coffee and leg stretching, and then you will continue with parallel sessions, and after that we will meet here at 12:30 to do the conclusions of the session. So have a nice time.